The rain outside drummed a slow, rhythmic beat against the frosted glass of the kitchen window, casting long, wavering shadows across the worn linoleum floor. It was late November in rural Alabama, the kind of cold that seemed to seep through the floorboards and settle deep into the bones of the old, uninsulated home. In the dimly lit living room, an old electric heater hummed softly, its orange glow fighting a losing battle against the damp chill. Jaden Carter sat at the corner of the small, hand-me-down wooden table, a single textbook open in front of him. He was 11 years old, with eyes far too old and observant for his age, and a quiet, steady demeanor that commanded respect from his peers. Tonight, however, those eyes were fixed on the worn-out sneakers resting against the table leg. His stomach gave a low, hollow rumble, a familiar and unwelcome companion that had shadowed him through the evening. At the stove, his mother, Sarah, was stirring a pot of thin vegetable soup. The aroma was faint, barely enough to mask the smell of the damp air outside. Sarah was a woman of deep faith and unyielding resilience, her hands rough and calloused from long shifts at the local textile mill. Her hair was pulled back into a neat, simple bun, and her face carried the quiet grace of someone who had learned to carry the weight of the world without breaking. "Jaden, sweetheart," Sarah's voice broke the quiet, gentle and soft-spoken. "Why don't you take a break from your reading and come have some dinner?" Quote. Jaden looked up, offering a reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He knew exactly how much was left in the pot, barely enough for a small bowl for his younger sister, Maya. Maya was 7, her bright, inquisitive spirit a constant source of joy in the house. But she had been fighting a persistent cough all week. She needed the nourishment far more than he did. "I'm really not that hungry, Mama," Jaden said, his voice steady, masking the truth behind his words. "I had a pretty big lunch at school." Sarah stopped stirring. She turned to look at her son, her dark eyes softening with a mixture of immense pride and quiet heartache. She knew the truth. She knew that the free school lunch was often his only meal. And she knew he had been skipping his portions at home for the past 3 days to ensure Maya had enough. It was a silent, agonizing dance between mother and son. A dance of dignity, love, and quiet sacrifice. "Jaden," Sarah walked over, wiping her hands on her apron, and placed a warm, comforting hand on his shoulder. "We have enough for everyone tonight. Please, sit down and eat with us." "Honestly, Mama, I'm fine," Jaden insisted, leaning into her touch. "I'm going to finish this chapter for history, and then I'll turn in." He turned back to the textbook, determined to keep his mind off the gnawing hunger in his belly. Sarah watched him for a long, quiet moment before letting out a soft, trembling breath. She nodded slowly, kissed the top of his head, and went to serve the small portions to Maya. In this house, faith wasn't just something they spoke about on Sundays. It was the bedrock of their existence. It was the belief that even in the darkest, coldest nights, there was a light waiting to be found. Jaden had inherited that deep-rooted faith, despite the struggles, despite the leaking roof and the unpaid electricity bill sitting on the counter. He believed that the future held something better. But tonight, the call, D, was relentless, and the silence in the house was heavy, punctuated only by the steady drum of the rain. Jaden closed his textbook, his fingers stiff from the cold, and looked over at the family photo hanging on the wall. It was a picture of his late father, a strong, kind man whose smile had lit up every room he entered. "Be the light, son," his father used to say. "Even when the world is dark, you carry the light." Jaden took a deep, shaky breath, pulled his thin jacket tighter around his shoulders, and listened to the rain, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The next afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving behind a heavy, gray mist that clung to the tall pine trees lining the highway. The air was biting and sharp. Jaden had spent the morning and early afternoon doing yard work for Mrs. Gable, the elderly neighbor 2 streets over, raking wet, heavy leaves from her lawn and clearing out her gutters. His hands were stiff, and his fingers were stained with dirt, but he held the crisp $5 bill in his pocket with a quiet sense of accomplishment. He was walking back home along the shoulder of the winding, 2-lane southern highway, his breath pluming in the cold air. His stomach was a tight knot of hunger, reminding him that the last real meal he had eaten was a slice of bread and peanut butter the day before. The scent of the local diner's fried chicken was drifting on the breeze, pulling him toward the small takeout counter on the corner of 5th Street. Jaden walked inside, the warmth of the diner momentarily shocking his cold cheeks. With his hard-earned $5 bill, he purchased the only thing he could afford, a small, greasy takeout box containing 2 pieces of crispy fried chicken and a single biscuit. It was his reward, his payment for hours of grueling work in the cold. Stepping back outside, the mist had turned into a fine, freezing drizzle. Jaden clutched the warm box against his chest, the heat seeping through the cardboard and warming his chilled core. He could almost taste the savory, salty crunch of the chicken. He imagined sharing it with Maya, perhaps giving her the larger piece while he took the smaller one. As he walked past the abandoned stretch of the highway, near the old mile marker 42 where the cell service always died, a pair of flashing hazard lights caught his attention through the mist. Parked on the shoulder was a massive, sleek luxury SUV, a vehicle so out of place on this rural stretch of road that it seemed like a mirage. Its hood was popped open, a faint wisp of steam rising into the cold air. An older man, dressed in a high-end wool coat that was completely inadequate for the damp Alabama cold, was struggling to loosen the lug nuts on the front tire, his hands visibly shaking. Next to him, sitting in the open door of the vehicle, was a frail-looking older woman. She was shivering, wrapped in a cashmere scarf, her breathing shallow and labored. Her eyes were closed, and she looked incredibly weak. Jaden stopped in his tracks. He recognized the couple from the local newspaper's business section. Harold and Eleanor Whitfield. They were the prominent figures of the Whitfield estate, old money nobility in this part of the state, known for their sprawling landholdings and distant philanthropy. But right now, they didn't look like wealthy titans. They just looked like 2 cold, scared, and desperate people stranded in the middle of nowhere. Jaden hesitated. He looked down at the warm box of food in his hands. He took a step forward, then stopped, his mind racing. This is your food, Jaden. You've worked all morning for this. You haven't eaten a full meal in 2 days. But then he looked at the woman in the car. Her head slumped slightly to the side, and a quiet, pained cough escaped her lips. The image of his sister Maya coughing in the cold flashed through his mind, followed by the memory of his father's words. Be the light. Jaden let out a long, quiet breath. Without thinking, he closed the distance between himself and the stranded vehicle, his boots crunching softly on the wet gravel. Excuse me, sir, Jaden called out, his young voice cutting through the damp silence. Harold Whitfield dropped his wrench and turned around, startled. His face was weathered, red from the cold, and etched with frustration. We have a flat tire, Harold said, his voice tense and exhausted. And this damn phone has no signal. My wife needs her medication. And I can't even get the tire off. Jaden didn't say a word. He walked up to the car, set his warm, greasy takeout box on the hood of the SUV, and reached into his pocket. He took out the heavy-duty jack and the tire iron he had used with Mrs. Gable, though Harold had already pulled out the car's own tools. I can help you with the tire, sir, Jaden said simply. his hands already moving with a practiced, steady rhythm. Harold watched in astonishment as the young boy, despite the freezing temperatures and the heavy mud, worked with a quiet, efficient grace. Within 15 minutes, the flat tire was off, and the spare was mounted and secured. Jaden wiped his dirty hands on his jeans and stepped back, breathing heavily. "Thank you, son," Harold said, his voice shaking with genuine emotion. "I don't know what we would have done out here. You're a lifesaver." It was then that Eleanor, wrapped in her scarf, opened her eyes and looked out the car window. Her gaze fell on the small, unassuming cardboard box sitting on the hood of the car. Her stomach growled audibly. Jaden looked at the box, then back at the frail woman. Without a second thought, he picked up the box, opened the lid to reveal the perfectly crispy, golden fried chicken and the biscuit, and held it out toward the couple. "You guys must be freezing and hungry," Jaden said, his voice remarkably soft and steady. "Please, take this. It's warm." Eleanor looked up, her eyes wide with surprise. A tear trickled down her pale cheek, catching the dim light of the street lamp that had just flickered to life. "Baby, what about you?" she asked, her voice trembling. "What about your food?" Quote. Jaden looked into her eyes, feeling a profound sense of peace wash over him. The gnawing emptiness in his stomach seemed to disappear, replaced by a deep, undeniable warmth. "I'll be all right, ma'am," Jaden said with a soft, genuine smile. "I've got plenty at home." Harold reached into his pocket, his hand coming out with a thick roll of $20 bills. He held it out toward the boy, his expression desperate. "Please, take this. Take it all. You cannot go hungry on our account." Jaden gently pushed the money back, his expression unwavering, full of a quiet dignity that left the older man speechless. "No, sir, I didn't help you for money. I helped you because you needed it." With a final nod, Jaden turned and walked back into the mist, leaving the Whitfields staring after him in stunned, reverent silence. The Whitfield estate was a sprawling, gated property nestled in the hills of neighboring Shelby County. It was a world of manicured lawns, grand white columns, and oil paintings that dated back to the turn of the century. But tonight, the grand estate felt incredibly still and heavy. Harold and Eleanor sat in the large, mahogany-paneled study, the fire crackling in the massive stone fireplace. Eleanor was wrapped in a plush wool blanket, a cup of hot tea resting on the table beside her, while Harold stared out the rain-streaked bay window. On the mantelpiece, a silver frame held a portrait of a young man with kind, laughing eyes. Daniel, their only son, who had passed away 6 years ago in a tragic accident. Daniel had been a man of the people, a gentle soul who believed that wealth was merely a tool to serve others. Seeing that young boy on the highway, giving up his only meal without a second thought, it was as if a ghost from the past had appeared before them. "Harold," Eleanor said, her voice barely more than a whisper, breaking the quiet, "did you see the look in his eyes?" There was no calculation there, no pretense, just pure, unadulterated goodness. Harold nodded slowly, his hands gripping the arms of his leather chair. "I saw it, Eleanor. It's been a long time since I've seen that kind of character in anyone, let alone a child living in the conditions he must be living in." They both looked up at Daniel's portrait. The parallel was striking, a sharp, undeniable reminder of the void left in their lives since their son's departure. Daniel had always dreamed of building a foundation to help the neglected corners of the rural South, places that the modern world had forgotten. "We can't just let this go, Harold," Eleanor said, her determination cutting through her frailty. "We have to find him. We have to know who he is and how we can help him. Not just with money, but in a way that truly honors Daniel." The following morning, Harold instructed his personal assistant to track down the boy. It took 2 days of inquiries and quiet visits to the local convenience stores and gas stations. Near mile marker 42, when the assistant finally returned with the name, Jaden Carter, and the address in the rundown section of the county, Harold and Eleanor were stunned. They drove to Jaden's neighborhood in a sleek, black town car, the dark-tinted windows rolling down to reveal a harsh, contrasting reality. Here, the roads were unpaved, the houses were covered in peeling paint, and the local school sat behind a rusted chain-link fence, its windows covered by plywood. It was a place of deep, systemic neglect, a community that the rising tide of economic growth had left behind. As the town car pulled up to the Carter home, Harold and Eleanor stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath their expensive shoes. They stood on the porch for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of a piano playing from inside, before Harold raised his hand and knocked. The door opened to reveal Sarah, her face a mask of polite caution, her posture rigid as she looked at the well-dressed couple standing on her porch. "Good morning, ma'am," Harold said, tipping his hat with a deep, respectful bow. "I am Harold Whitfield, and this is my wife, Eleanor. We are looking for Jaden." Sarah's eyes widened slightly in recognition. She had heard of the Whitfields, of course, but to see them standing on her humble porch was beyond anything she could have imagined. She looked at them carefully, sensing no harm, only a profound sense of gratitude and humility. "He's out in the backyard, Mr. Whitfield," Sarah said, stepping aside to let them in. "Please, come out of the cold." They stepped into the small, immaculately clean living room, the scent of Sarah's baking bread filling the air. As they walked toward the back porch, they saw Jaden. He was sitting on a wooden stool, meticulously repairing a broken bicycle for his younger sister with nothing more than a simple set of wrenches. When he looked up and saw the Whitfields, Jaden's expression didn't change. He wiped his hands on his pants and stood up, offering a respectful, polite nod. "Mr. Whitfield, Mrs. Whitfield," Jaden said, his voice calm and steady. "It's good to see you again. Are you having car trouble again?" Quote. Harold chuckled softly, a warm, genuine sound, and shook his head. "No, son. The car is running just fine. We came to see you." Eleanor walked forward, her eyes welling with tears. She reached out and took Jaden's calloused, dirt-stained hands in hers. "You gave us your only food that night, Jaden. You didn't know us. You had nothing, and yet you gave us everything. We haven't been able to stop thinking about it since." Sarah joined them, her eyes darting between her son and the wealthy couple, a mixture of pride and protective anxiety rising within her. "We aren't here to offer you charity, Mrs. Carter," Harold said, turning to Sarah with a deep look of sincerity. "We are here to honor a promise we made to our son, Daniel, who we lost some years ago. Jaden showed us what true wealth looks like. Now, we want to show him what true legacy means." The Whitfields' proposal was not simply a check written to ease their own conscience. It was a comprehensive plan to revitalize the community, starting with the establishment of the Second Chance Project. The initiative was designed to fund school infrastructure, provide clean water and electricity to the forgotten neighborhoods, and create after-school programs that would give children like Jaden a safe space to learn and grow. But not everyone in the Whitfield family was pleased with this sudden shift in the family's philanthropic focus. Marcus Whitfield, Harold's nephew and the chief financial officer of the Whitfield Holdings, was a man whose soul was measured entirely in quarterly margins and stock options. He had been eyeing the family fortune for years, viewing the old man's philanthropic habits as an expensive nuisance. When word of the Second Chance Project reached Marcus, he was furious. The following week, Marcus arrived at the estate with a briefcase full of legal documents. his tailored suit sharp and immaculate. He found Harold and Eleanor in the sunroom, reviewing the architectural plans for the new community center. "Uncle Harold, have you lost your mind?" Marcus's voice cut through the quiet, filled with sharp, condescending arrogance. "You are planning to pour millions of dollars into a project in a forgotten county, run by a single mother with no financial background, and her 11-year-old boy? This is a complete and utter waste of corporate assets." Harold didn't look up from his papers. "The Second Chance Project is not corporate property, Marcus. It is managed through the Whitfield Family Trust, which Eleanor and I control. For now." "You do," Marcus sneered, stepping closer to the table. "But as the CFO and the acting head of the Whitfield board, I have a fiduciary duty to stop this madness. You are being manipulated by a family of opportunists who saw an easy mark on a rainy highway." "Watch your mouth, Marcus," Harold said, his voice low, cold, and dangerous. "That boy saved your aunt's life when you wouldn't have even bothered to stop the car. He is a child, and she is an impoverished woman trying to secure a handout," Marcus replied, crossing his arms. "I have already begun filing the injunctions. I've sent our legal team to question the boy's mother, and I've got the local zoning board ready to declare the project site unfit for construction. They won't see a dime of that money." The tension in the room was palpable. Marcus was banking on the Carter family's lack of resources and legal representation, believing that a quiet threat would be enough to send them running. But he hadn't reckoned on the moral anchor of Jaden Carter. Later that afternoon, Marcus and his legal representatives arrived at the community center site, where the local families had gathered to celebrate the initial groundbreaking. Marcus stood on the makeshift stage, a sneer on his face as he addressed the crowd, trying to humiliate Sarah and Jaden in front of their neighbors. "You people really think this gravy train is going to last?" Marcus's voice boomed through the microphone, echoing off the rusted walls of the old schoolyard. "This company is not a charity for those who can't take care of themselves. You are being used by a child who played the hero to get a payout." The crowd fell into an uncomfortable, tense silence. Sarah's face flushed with anger. But before she could speak, Jaden stepped up onto the stage. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at the crowd, his small, thin frame standing straight and tall. Jaden took the microphone, his hands steady, his voice clear and resonant, carrying across the silent yard. "I didn't help Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield for money," Jaden said, his voice echoing in the cold air. "I helped them because they needed it. Because in this community, that's what we do. We don't have a lot of money, but we have our word. And we have our dignity." He turned to look directly into Marcus's cold, calculating eyes. "You can take the money away. You can try to stop the building. But you can't stop us from being the light. Because our character isn't for sale." The days following Marcus's confrontation at the groundbreaking site were filled with uncertainty and tension. Marcus utilized every legal trick in the book, attempting to freeze the Whitfield family trust assets and tie the initiative up in court for years. He firmly believed the Carters would walk away out of fear and exhaustion, leaving him in control of the family's vast resources without interference. However, Marcus drastically underestimated the resolve of the community and the determination of Harold Whitfield. Upon learning of the legal maneuvers, Harold hired a dedicated team of independent civil rights lawyers to counter the injunctions. Furthermore, Eleanor brought the conflict before the full Whitfield board, presenting a detailed, transparent ledger that highlighted the profound moral impact and long-term tax benefits of the project. As the legal proceedings advanced, news of the rural initiative began to attract wider media attention. Reporters from across the state traveled to the county to document the inspiring story of an 11-year-old boy who had shared his only meal with the Whitfields. The spotlight brought pressure to bear on the corporate board, forcing them to reevaluate Marcus's aggressive tactics. The resulting public backlash made it clear that fighting the charitable project would damage the firm's reputation beyond repair. In the second week of December, the Whitfield board called an emergency meeting. Following an overwhelming vote of confidence in Harold's philanthropic vision, Marcus was stripped of his executive powers and removed from the board entirely. The court subsequently dismissed the injunctions, clearing the path for the community development initiatives to proceed immediately. By early spring, the construction of the community center was fully underway. Heavy machinery hummed across the former site of the abandoned school, clearing the grounds and laying the foundation for a state-of-the-art facility that would house a library, medical services, and an after-school computer lab. The unpaved roads leading into the neighborhood were resurfaced, and a clean water initiative brought fresh, reliable utility connections to every household on the block. Jaden and Maya now had a dedicated community center to visit after school, complete with tutors and healthy meals that ensured no child in their neighborhood would ever have to go to bed hungry. Sarah was hired to manage the community center's new baking and catering program, providing her with a stable income that allowed her to pay off the old electricity bill and repair the roof of their home. One afternoon in April, the warm southern breeze carried the scent of blooming dogwood trees through the neighborhood. Harold and Eleanor Whitfield drove back to the Carter home, this time not in a sleek town car, but in a modest vehicle. Accompanied by the town's mayor and several local families, they walked up to the newly painted front porch of the Carter house, where Sarah greeted them with a warm embrace and fresh bread. Jaden came out to the porch, wiping his hands after finishing another repair on a neighbor's lawnmower. Harold smiled warmly, placing a gentle hand on the young boy's shoulder. "The first phase of the library is complete, Jaden," Harold said, his eyes reflecting a deep and abiding pride. "We have dedicated the main wing in memory of Daniel, and we would be honored if you would cut the ribbon at the grand opening ceremony next week." Jaden looked at the bright, clean streets and the vibrant new buildings rising in the distance. He thought back to the cold, rainy November night when the cupboard had been empty and the house had been dark. Now, the neighborhood was alive with the laughter of children and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. "I'd be honored, sir," Jaden replied, a genuine, radiant smile finally reaching his eyes. "We just carried the light. Like my father said, the whole community built it together."